Plugin of the week is the L2 Ultramaximizer. So in setting up the Ultramaximizer, the basic idea is that it's a brick wall limiter. Okay, and what brick wall means is that when a certain threshold or level is exceeded, none more passes, right? So the idea of brick wall, if you imagine sort of driving into a brick wall, the brick wall stays there, your car gets crushed, and you die probably. And that could happen to your mix if you hit it going 70 miles an hour. But it acts as a positioning or an end stop, essentially, for your music. Now, when overused, this creates a significant amount of distortion. When used properly, then what it does is it actually helps to add gain to your overall mix. One of the basic ideas of using a brick wall limiter in terms of mastering, which is really where it would be used, is that it would always be the last stage of the processing. Typically, if you use the actual quantization and the dithering at the end, right? So this is designed specifically to be the end stage of your processing. So if you were mastering or you're mixing and you do your bus compression and you do your equalization or any other things that you would do on the stereo fader, right? And if you're following a mix program, you're doing very little of that because you've done it on all the tracks, but that's another story. If you come in and you put this at the end stage, and let's just say this is not to send to mastering, but this is like the mix, the reference mix that you're sending off to the artist, then the basic idea is that you would have a threshold and an output ceiling. And what this does is it prevents you from clipping the output in terms of dBFS. So what keeps the overall gain of most songs from maximizing out, because if you just play your mix as it is, you will set it to up to a point where maybe you're just before clipping or just prior to clipping, but the overall gain isn't as loud as you would like it to be. And that's because there are certain transient peaks within the production that are standing out too much, that are preventing you from getting more overall level. If those transient peaks are very, very short, within a couple of milliseconds, then you can trim them off pretty aggressively without hearing the audible effects of it, okay? The basic way, and what's really cool about this that differs from other maximizers, is that the fundamental way that you use it is that you start playing audio through it, and then you use the tied connection that pulls down the output ceiling and the threshold at the same time. The way that this maximizer works is that when you pull down the threshold, and let's say we set it to -6, then no audio level will pass beyond -6. But if the output ceiling is 0, then it will add 6 dB to the overall level. So everything will sound literally 6 dB louder, right? Or 4 times as loud as the original. So when you set it, in order to hear the distortion properly, you need to bring the threshold and the output ceiling down simultaneously. Otherwise, when you pull the threshold down, it will just sound louder, which always sounds better, right? So as I crank this down, right, you could start to you really hear and see the limiting and the compression here. So the idea is that, the point being here is this is like an end stage of the mix that you do just when you're sending it off to somebody, not something that you're monitoring or having in circuit the whole time that you're working. So this is something that you would bypass while you were mixing, but at the end stage when you're saying, okay, I want to print this mix and I just want to get the gain to be basically, up to standard, so when they listen to this and compare it to maybe other CDs or other productions that we're comparing it to, that it sounds closer in overall gain, right, without crushing it. So the idea is that we're pulling this down until we hear the distortion and then we're backing off, right? So let's just see if we can find that place. And you can see that backbeat, that clack, was primarily what's triggering it, right? So I'm going to bring it up here just a touch beyond that. So I kind of got that to the place. And it's not really keying in that much, but what it's doing is if I set this to -6 and I didn't set, and let me just set the output ceiling to -0.1, right? I never set it to 0. And I'll also explain one other thing that's really important to understand about this, because if you're exporting this mix as an MP3, then actually you want to give an extra dB of headroom, because when an audio file is converted into an MP3 format, the conversion process, and same for AAC files, which is an MP4 file, or or if you're getting into that with the iTunes format. Then what happens is, as part of the process of data compressing it and it deciding what it doesn't like and think it's important in the audio and what it does think is important, there will sometimes be gain added. So if you output your mix at minus 0.1 or at 0, when you run it through and you convert it to an MP3, most often you will end up with some kind of distortion characteristic and the sound will not be as good. And there have been a lot of tests that have been done where they realize that if you're exporting it as an MP3, you're better off setting the output ceiling to minus 1 or minus 2. And even though the overall output gain of the MP3 may not be as loud, the sound quality will be better. And so there's an element of that there. But let's just for the sake of volume, I'll set this to minus 3 here. So what we're doing is we're taking everything that is passes above minus 6 dBFS, clipping it down, and then taking that overall gain and bringing it up to the output ceiling. So when you have this, one other thing that's cool here is that you have what's called an automatic release control. And so what that does is the release control is generally very fast, okay? But if you have the ARC, then it's going to change that release time characteristic so that if a lot of material is going over it, it's going to slow it down so that you don't get as much distortion, or you won't get the same kind of distortion. Whereas if it's just simple transients, it'll be faster. To get a more transparent sound with it, if you're just kind of doing peaks, you can actually set it manually, turn it off, set it to the fastest setting, and then you won't really hear it as much. And the release time will be much faster. You won't necessarily see it reflected here, because if it actually displayed as fast as it was going here, you wouldn't see anything at all, right? Or if you wanted to smooth out the overall mix, you could slow it down, and then it acts more like a peak limiter. And what a peak limiter will do is it will kind of very fast attack, will clip the transient peak, but it will be more sustaining. And that's more of like a broadcast type of compression. And sometimes in mastering, that is also used as a smoothing effect, right? So if you just want to take, like, everything is a little too jumpy and jittery and kind of all over the place, this would be a way of just sort of pulling it all together a little bit more, right? If you understand that. And this may be an exaggerated, because that's 1 second. So you could hear how much that gain is affected, right? Smoother, but not as loud, right? And then there is the super fast release. So this will actually give you the loudest, but it may give you more distortion depending upon how much you're pulling it in. The ARC will give it a little bit more body, okay, but a little bit less overall volume. And then going to a slower time will give you the most amount of body or basic sustain, but the lowest amount of overall gain pickup, if that makes. So when you're printing the mix, if you are converting to an MP3, it's actually best to leave your quantization off. Okay, you leave your quantization off. And so basically, if you keep it at 24 bits, then you will get the most actually out of your MP3 conversion. If you're going to a straight WAV file and you're sending something CD quality, then you would convert to 16-bit. The different types of dither are based off of, just from the waves dither, because every dither is different. You would go type 1 for the vast majority of mixes. So that's just like, dither is a noise that's added in, a low-level noise that creates some randomness in the low-level energy. So instead of just truncating the last 8 bits when you convert from 24-bit to 16-bit, what it does is it adds some randomness in that low-end energy, so that in the bottom end of the bit structure, when it's 16-bit, there's a little more randomness in there, which adds a little bit more of a sense of space, and you get a little bit more of the feel of the randomness that you get when you have those extra 8 bits available. if that makes sense. That's the quick answer to that. And the noise shaping is something that the best way to do this is to just close your eyes and click through the options. And what noise shaping is, when noise is applied, it can be full frequency, right? So if that would be none, right? So it's just basically white noise. And then you could go to different shapings, which affects what frequency area the noise is added in on. And that can make it more or less audible. So what you want to listen for is what gives you the most sense of depth to what it is that you're listening to. So if you're just listening and you're just kind of clicking through, you may not hear any difference at all. In which case, just go with normal. If you hear some kind of a difference, it may add, you'll get this feeling like everything is just a little bit deeper. And that's like the kind of quick way of going with that. So it's actually, in a simple tool that has basically more or less 3 sliders, one that a large variety of the time you don't use in a dithering section. And actually there's a lot of options. And when you really understand it, then you can really get the most out of using it. So, and it's a classic one, and it still has a unique characteristic sound that goes beyond, that people are very used to, right? Because it is a revolutionary processor, the L1, which was the predecessor to this. And when the L2 came out, it's like, okay, now not only did we do this revolutionary technique, but now it sounds good too, which is a bonus, right? And the L3 sort of blew it out and gave you a whole other series of options, right? Increased the number of flavors in terms of the way that you can apply it and the different frequency areas that you can apply it in, and it multi-bands out, and that's really what you're getting into with the L3. But there you have it, the L2 Ultramaximizer. Very, very cool limiter, and even used in the mix stage, it's a very powerful part of mixing in terms of just presenting your material in somewhat of a little bit more of a mastered kind of fashion, right? So when people listen to it, it's like, wow, that sounds really cool. You want to do it such a way that it's tasteful without overdoing it, and I think that's where this plugin is most beneficial. But great one to have in the tool bag. Okay, there you have it, the plugin of the week, the L2 Ultramaximizer.